Best thing to do is for me to introduce myself. My name's John Kornacki. I'm the Assistant Director of the Washington Institute for Public Affairs Research. We're one of the sponsoring groups here today. The Washington Institute for Public Affairs Research is really it's the gateway between the research faculty and the outside world. We help fund projects, research projects. We help the faculty work on their ideas, and we like to share the fruits of those ideas with the public at large. I guess this would be an example of just what that is. We're delighted to have, by the way, John Gould is the director of that program. He's my boss, and he's here today. I wanted to recognize him. I also have the pleasure of having the co-sponsorship of the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies, which many of you have heard of, directed by Jim Thurber. And one of my panelists, Antoine Yoshinaka, is affiliated with them. In fact, Dante Cini is affiliated with them as well. So we're delighted to both co-sponsor this event for you. Now, but overall, I think the best way to describe what we're trying to do today, this is a big public briefing in this fine room, is really about the School of Public Affairs. Both of our units are here. You, the students, are from here, at least most of you, and many of the faculty members are from the school. This will be the first in a series of what we think will be entertaining and enlightening discussions for your involvement that involve the research that we do here. And there's really no one more important that could tell you about this story than the person who has encouraged this from the get-go. When I met the new dean, she's been here about 1.5 years now, she continues to talk about how proud she is of the high-impact research that's done at this school. And so there's really no one better to introduce this session than the dean of the School of Public Affairs, a scholar in her own right, Barbara Romzak. Barbara.
Thank you, John. And I want to start out by complimenting John Gould and John Kornacki and the work of the YPAR group, as well as the sponsorship of the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies. Jim Thurber's group brings a great deal of knowledge and expertise to this, and of course the YPAR has been busy trying to create these briefings for us. Now, these briefings are very important to the School of Public Affairs. They're important because they are an opportunity for us to bring experts from DC to campus for our students, but it's also a chance for us to showcase our faculty and the research that's being done on campus about important pressing issues of the day. And we're going to be talking about fragmentation of political discourse. We're going to be talking about shifting suburbs and where the voting emphasis tends to be these days. All of this is important for us to understand current politics. The current politics have become, you just need to look at the morning's newspapers, increasingly fragmented, and we as a country are facing important issues that are going to have serious economic impact. We're facing just this, in the next few weeks, we're facing important challenges over whether the government is going to continue to be operating after October 1st. We're facing an issue of a crisis about whether we will have approval for extending the debt ceiling. Both of those can affect significantly the perception of how effective the United States is, how effective our federal government is, what kind of health we have as a political community. The underlying dynamics of those kind of contentious debates are going to be explained to us today. It's rooted in our politics. Now, we're going to find out what that is, we're going to find out what we can do about it, and we're going to find out it's really related to some very complicated shifting demographics, some complicated economics, and some geographic shifts that we're having. I ask you to join me, please, in welcoming the panel, in welcoming our distinguished guests, and also welcoming the C-SPAN viewers out there. Thank you.
Thank you again, Barbara. In many ways, this is the fruits of the work that you and the faculty have done for this past year in kind of identifying key directions for the school to move into. So we're delighted to bring this panel to you. And just let me briefly introduce the panelists. You have before you two of the best pollsters around from the best organizations around. Mike Bloomfield from the Mellman Group. I would say, how would we put that? a left-leaning political organization who's worked... A Democrat. Well, I was being kinder, or more softer. Mike, we're delighted you can be here representing the Mellman Group, and we have on the other side of this, Bill McInturff, who's the president of Public Opinion Strategy, who works with, I was going to say the right-sided, but I'll say Republican-oriented candidates, who will look at this data these data that we have today. And in between them is Elizabeth Williamson, who happens to be a co-writer at the Wall Street Journal with our project director, Dante Cini, who will also share what she's been doing. I mentioned earlier someone was looking at Loudoun County, and Elizabeth has been taking her lens to Loudoun County recently. Joining them will be Antoine Yonashaka, who is a colleague of mine in the Department of Government in the School of Public Affairs. Antoine is doing a lot of fundamental work on congressional redistricting, among other things, and is also going to share his insight into looking at the data that is unfolded. One of the very first faculty members I met when I came to campus was the gentleman to my immediate left, a rather unusual member of the faculty since he's not a social scientist. Almost all of the scholars in the School of Public Affairs are, in fact, social scientists, usually political scientists, some economists. Yeah, there's a few lawyers in there, too. But Dante is a journalist, an active journalist, and shall we say he's an inventor, too. The thing that makes Dante kind of unique is that he has the head or the brain of a social scientist, but he has the heart of a journalist. A few years ago...
Who's good at math.
Yeah, he's good at math. For journalists, unusual, right? And he's played around with numbers. A few years ago, he invented something you may be familiar with called Patchwork Nation. And instead of looking at states, he began to look at counties as the units that are most interesting, perhaps the most fundamental in understanding the way the country is moving, not just politically, but in a whole realm of things. We're delighted that Dante has evolved that project into something we now call the New American Communities Project, based right here at the School of Public Affairs at American University. And in talking to Dante about this early on, many of us thought, wow, there's some interesting stuff in here. We should get into it. We should share it. Hence, the development of this panel and the development of what Dante Cini, journalist and social scientist, will now tell us about the American Communities Project. Dante.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Dean, and thank you all for coming today. I know it might have been hard to get up after finding out the Redskins are 0-3, but life goes on, and so we're all here. What I want to do quickly is offer a brief overview of what the ACP is, the American Communities Project, and how it works, what we can do with it. And then I want to swing and talk about the suburbs. The ACP was really born out of my frustration with Red and Blue America. I think Red and Blue America are fine for understanding scorekeeping. You got to keep score. We essentially have two teams in America. We have a red team and a blue team. We got to fill maps in and see who wins. But the problem with those maps is that, there we go, is that they become shorthand definitions for the country, and I think they miss the point. So, you know, you have the 2004 Kerry Bush map on the left and what it has kind of devolved into, or what it did devolve into for a lot of people in the United States. And I think that, again, we have to have a way of keeping score, but that map obviously misses a lot of nuance. I'm sure it was created by somebody in the United States of Canada. It really misses the red parts of New York, it misses the blue parts of Texas, but it also misses really the differences between different kinds of blue places. There's a difference between an inner city Democratic community and a college town that's a Democratic community. There's a difference between rural Nebraska and, you know, ex-urban Minneapolis. These places are different, and this really does that a huge disservice. The other way we like to talk about politics in this country is we like to talk about demographics. I like talking about demographics too, talking about men, women, African Americans, Hispanics. There are people on the stage who do very good work with this data, and I write about this data often. I like it. My problem with it has always been that it takes these people and it disassociates them from place too much, so that this woman who's 20-something and lives in New York and likes to go to a lot of the clubs that I used to like to go to, looks the same as this woman who lives really in rural Kansas and has 4 kids and lives a very different kind of life. So in response to these kind of 2 different ways of looking at America, a solely demographic system and a system that's based really just on big units of geography and about whether they're Democratic or Republican, we came up with this, the American Communities Project. And what we did is we basically took scores of demographic data sets, and we looked at them across every county in the country, and we used a clustering technique to identify different kinds of community in America. And if you look at this map, you'll see some are very regional. You see some along the south, you see the southeast, you see along the southwest, you see the big chunk around Utah. You see the purple areas through there, it's a lot of evangelicals in there. But then some are really not so much about regions as they are about really urban, suburban culture and metropolitan culture. And you see those places pop up around, you'll see pink and orange around Detroit, Chicago, Minneapolis. You'll see a bit of it in Denver. And then you see it really along the East Coast. And these places, this is really a different kind of place in America that's not about a region so much as it is kind of about a mindset, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. When you take this map and you look at it just in terms of the sheer data, this is what the numbers look like. 15 different types of communities in America, and these are the number of counties for each and the population for each. What we're going to do today, I'm going to try to use this laser point. I've never done this before. It should be fun. We're going to talk about these exurbs. We're going to talk about the big cities, the suburbs around them, and the urban suburbs. This is the way to think of these places is the big cities are by and large, the counties that hold the 50 largest cities in America. The urban suburbs are kind of densely populated suburban areas, mostly sit immediately next to those big cities. Some are scattered, but mostly sit next to those big cities. Middle suburbs are based primarily in the Rust Belt and in the Midwest. They're suburban places that sit near big cities, but they're fundamentally different. They're whiter, they're less educated, they're slightly older. And then the exurbs, which are kind of, I think most of us know what an exurb is, but it's the next ring out, right? It's the next ring out after looking at an urban area. So what does this tell us? So what, right? What does this all mean? What this means is it gives you a different way of looking at all sorts of data. Any data that's geotagged, where you know where the person came from, right? This includes census data, unemployment data, anything about culture, so polling data about what people watch, what they read. You can use this to filter the numbers and look at it in a different way. And what we're going to do right now is look at what it means for the 2012 election, because I think it's particularly instructive at looking at the results from 2012. If we can do that. There we go. Okay. These are the 2012 exit polls. This is what happened is, there's a massive exit poll taken the night of the election, and then they break them down, and when they break them down, this is what it looks like. This is what it looked like for 2012 anyway. Barack Obama wins huge in urban areas, Mitt Romney wins huge in rural areas, and then Romney ekes out a win in the suburbs. I think that the problem with this breakdown is that the United States is much more complicated than just having cities, suburbs, and rural areas. I think you miss a lot when you look at it this way. And when you use the American Communities Project, the ACP, to break down the data, it looks like this. So Obama still wins huge in the big cities, obviously. Romney wins huge in these exurban areas. This is the metropolitan. Again, we're just focusing on metropolitan America right now. The exurban areas, he wins huge. Middle suburbs, Romney ekes out a victory. But the thing that's, I think, really telling in these numbers, and I'll show you why in a second, is these urban suburbs. These are places that are, this is really suburban America, and depending on your definition, but the way we define it. And when you define it this way, a 16-point win is a pretty big win. But it's even more telling when you look at what's happened since 2000. I hope you can see these. Okay, this over here on the top, you're looking at the big cities. These are the vote in the urban burbs. The blue line is obviously a Democratic candidate. Red line is a Republican candidate. Middle suburbs and the exurbs. In 2000, George W. Bush narrowly lost the popular vote. He won the election, narrowly lost the popular vote by less than 1 million votes. He won these exurban areas by 19 percentage points, okay? In 2012, Mitt Romney lost by a substantial margin. He lost by about 5 million votes. He still won the exurbs by 18 percentage points. He only did 1 percentage point worse than George W. Bush did in 2000. The big change has come in what's happened in these big cities. And again, particularly these urban burbs, these urban suburbs are very interesting to me because what happened is Al Gore did win the urban suburbs by 11 percentage points, in 2000, but Barack Obama won them by 16 percentage points in 2012. And that's in a year where you really had people that were unhappy with the economic direction of the country, unhappy with the direction of the country as a whole. And this suggests to me that something's going on. By the way, I will say the urban suburbs, Obama beat Romney by about 5 million votes in those places, which is what he won the election by. Now, look, there are all sorts of other things going on in different kinds of communities around the country, but that gap is very significant. So what's going on in these places? Why are the suburbs different, or how are they different? I think they're different than we imagine them, and they've become more different over the past 10 years or so. This is just looking at really income and poverty in America using these 4 types. And the thing that's interesting to me about these numbers is you can see the urban suburbs are the wealthiest. They hold the most wealthy people, more incomes, 200,000 and above than any other type. Definitely any of these 4 types. But you see the number right behind them are these big city areas. They're actually, the exurbs are very close. The big cities and exurbs are very close. But you can see that the big cities and the urban suburbs are not as far apart in this area as you might think they are. I think a lot of people might assume that the suburbs are more like the exurbs in this way. But in terms of big wealth, in some ways big earners, they're more like the cities. The other thing that's interesting to me is when you look at poverty. The big cities obviously have the highest poverty among these 4 types. And that's, we all know what urban poverty is like. We can see it in Washington, D.C. You can see it in a lot of cities. But the thing that's interesting is the urban suburbs are not, they're 5 points back, or it's 17% versus 12%. But they're higher than the exurbs. These urban suburbs are places where you have poverty and you have high wealth at the same time. The other thing that's interesting to me about them, when you look at the median household income, the urban suburbs are the wealthiest. That means Barack Obama, out of all the types that I look at in the American Communities Project, the urban suburbs, they're not just the wealthiest of these 4 types, they're the wealthiest in the country. Using this breakdown, Barack Obama won these wealthiest, or the highest median household income counties in the country by 16 percentage points. And I think that's kind of counterintuitive for a lot of people. And it suggests that there's something different going on in these places than we thought. One thing that's been going on, really quickly, is demographic shifts. So when you look at these numbers here, what you'll see is that the white population, these are numbers from 2000 and 2011, the white population in the urban suburbs has dropped by 4 percentage points. And it's dropped everywhere, but the interesting thing in the burbs is the urban burbs is it's now below 70%. It's 69%. In fact, there's now only a 9 percentage point divide in terms of the percentage of white population in the big city counties and the urban burbs. There was a 14 percentage point difference in 2000. There's now only a 9 percentage point difference, and that's actually because the big cities, through gentrification, these big city counties have actually grown whiter in some ways. And then the other thing that's very interesting is the Hispanic population. The Hispanic population for the urban burbs has risen. It's risen everywhere, you can see, but what's happened is in 2000, the urban burb Hispanic population was roughly equal to the US number. It was 12.5 nationally. It was 12.7 in the urban burbs. It was pretty close. In the last 10 years, the urban burbs have accelerated, and they are now about a percentage point higher than the national average. So while the country has grown more Hispanic, the urban burbs in particular have grown more Hispanic. And I think that may have, when you look at, and as I look at with Bill's numbers often, because we work with POS, and you always see there's a big Hispanic divide. You see it in any set of polling data that's pro-democratic, right? They lean Democratic. I wanted to talk about one more shift, and I'm going to turn it over to Antoine. I like, consumer culture, I think, is really undervalued as a measure of what's going on in the country. We work with Experian. I have access to all of Experian's data now, Experian Consumer Services. They have basically 10,000 surveys in the field. Every month they're coming in, and they ask people everything from political preference to the soap they buy to the coffee they drink. And with that data, they actually create indexes. They can tell you places that overrepresent for liberals and underrepresent for conservatives, or vice versa. So when you look at Starbucks, the average, if you were an average store, you get equal amounts of liberals and conservatives, it would be 100 for each. Yeah, Starbucks over-indexes heavily for liberals. It's 140 versus a conservative index of 91. When you look at the Starbucks in these communities, obviously they're the most in the big cities, surprise. But there are far more in the urban suburbs, and I actually broke this out. I didn't have room on the slide. I broke this out by per 100,000 population as well, and there's a nice stair effect. In the big cities, it's about 5.5 Starbucks for every 100,000 people. In the urban suburbs, it's about 4.4 Starbucks for every 100,000 people. And in the exurbs, it's about 3.4 Starbucks for every 100,000 people. And you can see when you talk about the increases in the number of stores between 2008 even and 2013, these urban burbs have seen far more. They've seen a much more growth in Starbucks. What does this mean? What it means is that consumer culture, while we might kind of make fun of it, it's not really culture, I guess, but it is, and that it really defines what a place is about. And these places, when you look at the kind of stores that are in them, the kinds of retail experiences that people have, which really ultimately shape their view of reality, they're trending more and more democratic. And I do think that the long run, what all these numbers mean to me over time, when you add everything up, these places are shifting democratic, and it's going to become increasingly a problem for Republicans if they can't reach these people. They need to find a way to reach these people. The populations are growing, as Antoine will talk about in a second. They're shifting democratic, and the Republicans need to find a way to basically reach them again. The line used to be really between the cities that were Democratic and the exurbs that were Republican, and the suburbs were more of a battleground. I think what's happened over the past 12 years in particular is the suburbs have increasingly shifted Democratic. And over the long term, I think that's a real problem for the GOP. And now, with that, I'll turn it over to Antoine. Thanks.
All right. So my name is Antoine Yoshinaka. I'm a professor in the government department. I guess I'm the token professor on the panel today. I'll keep my comments brief, relatively brief. But before I get into it, I just want to touch upon three very big themes that I'm going to talk about today. So the first one is, obviously this country has been growing quite a bit lately. But the growth is not equal everywhere. There are areas that are growing at a much faster rate than others. And what I want to show you today is that the areas that are providing the most growth in this country are areas where actually Democrats have been doing increasingly well. And conversely, where Democrats have been doing not so well in the last 10 years are areas that are not growing very fast and are not, or some of them are actually not growing at all. And so for the Republicans in the room, I think that's something that you really want to understand, to see where the demographic shifts are occurring and where the political shifts are occurring. Number two, I think, building upon what Dante said, I think it's important to understand that this category known as suburbs really masks some very important heterogeneity between, on the one hand, exurbs and middle suburbs, and on the other hand, urban suburbs. And so that's the number 2 point. And the third point is to show you some data to suggest that some of this bifurcation between urban suburbs and the rest is really a recent phenomenon. We're talking about the last 10 years or so. And so the data that I'm going to show you today and discuss will speak to those three themes. So first of all, this is the first graph looks at the breakdown by county types, right? So there are 15 county types. Where Barack Obama in 2012 did better than Al Gore. You see at the bottom there, these are the big cities. This is where, obviously, Al Gore won the big cities by about 20 points. Obama won the big cities by 30 points, right? He did considerably better in the big cities. He did better also in the college towns, Hispanic centers. And on the other hand, he did poorly relative to Gore in sort of the evangelical areas of the country, in sort of the working class areas of the country. Now, what this masks, just looking at this first graph, what we don't know is how much growth these various areas have sustained over the last decade or so. So you see here on the right, those are areas that provide the most growth in this country. That's about 60% of the growth in the last 10 years, a little bit more than 60%, comes from big cities, urban suburbs, and exurbs. And if you look, those are three areas where Barack Obama did considerably better than Al Gore, especially the big cities, again, by about 10 percentage points, and the urban suburbs by about 6 percentage points. And also, let's note, he actually did better than Al Gore did in exurbs. He still lost the exurbs by quite a big margin, but the point is that it's trending a tiny bit toward the Democratic Party. Now, you see this dot here that's right about 0. Those are the middle suburbs. Those are areas where that actually haven't grown as much as these other areas, and where Obama and Gore did about equally, about the same. And then those are the areas that you could look compared to 2000 election and 2012, and you see that Barack Obama did much worse than Al Gore did. But you look at those, and those are areas that are not growing a lot, and that are not providing much of the growth of this country. Because even if an area is growing a lot, if we're talking about small numbers, ultimately much of the growth is not coming from those areas. So LDS enclaves, obviously Mitt Romney being Mormon, working class country, evangelical hubs. Sure, Barack Obama lost these and did rather poorly in those, but this is not where the country is growing. The 3 areas on the right, the big cities, the urban suburb, the exurbs, those areas together represent about 175 million Americans in those 3 areas alone. Whereas evangelical hubs are about 12 million, working class countries about, I think, 8 million or so, and LDS enclaves about 3 million. So those 3 red dots are about 25 million Americans living in those, whereas those 3 blue dots at the upper right have about 175 million Americans living in them. So let's look at what has happened. Looking at one issue, we picked one issue. There are obviously many issues that are important in the electorate and in any given election, but we'll stick to this one, which is global warming. So every election, there's usually a question on surveys that ask voters if they think that global warming is, in this case, a very serious problem, somewhat serious problem. There's also the not a very serious problem or not a problem at all. So if we combine the very serious and somewhat serious problem, you can see a clear divide between folks who live in the big cities and the urban suburbs, where about 70% think that global warming is either a very serious or a somewhat serious problem. And then you move on to the middle suburbs and the exurbs, where it's somewhere around 55% of Americans who think that that global warming is a big problem. So that's about a 15-point gap. Now, if you go back just 6 years ago, 7 years ago, in 2006, on the left there, the same question about global warming, and you see the breakdown between the 4 categories, not so much of a divide anymore. Right? So even just 7 years ago, folks who lived in the big cities, the suburbs, the middle suburbs, the exurbs, they all thought that global warming was a problem at about a 75% rate. And then you fast forward to 2012, and that divide is clearly present between, on the one hand, big cities and urban suburbs, and middle suburbs and exurbs. And those are the trends that we think are partly explaining why urban suburbs are really areas where Democrats are doing increasingly better, and they're resembling cities more and more. For those of you familiar with the DC area, right, we're talking about Montgomery County. Right? That would be an example of an urban suburb, and how people who live in Montgomery County, ideologically and in terms of partisanship, are probably much more like folks who live in DC rather than folks who live sort of further out outside of the DC area. So before I turn the microphone over, I just wanted to leave you with 2 questions that that this raises, I think, that this research raises that we don't have an answer yet. One is that we don't know yet whether this is an Obama effect or a party effect. So in 2014 and in 2016, once Barack Obama is off the ballot, will these trends continue, or will they revert back to a pre-Obama era? That's obviously something we can't answer right now. And the second one is, if it's true that urban suburbs are changing, I think the natural question that emerges from that is whether it's changing because new people are moving in and bringing with them a different set of ideological preferences and issue preferences, et cetera, or are those shifts occurring because people who have lived in those areas for a while are changing their minds, right? They're looking at the political landscape, they're looking at politics at the national level in Congress, And they're changing their mind when it comes to issues such as global warming, when it comes to issues such as gay marriage and abortion. And so I'll leave you with those questions and turn the microphone over to Elizabeth.
I would, suggest that maybe we sort of throw it open and
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. What we're going to do now is let the panel take a look. First off, the three of you, could be Elizabeth, you could start this if you wish to take a look at what your reactions are to this, and then anybody else on the panel to kind of take a look at it. I can tell you something. I'll start with you, Elizabeth, because we talked about Loudoun County and what's changing, and you may want to start with them. Yesterday, I went out to the rural parts of Loudoun County, a place called Bluemont. Now, Bluemont is as far west in Loudoun as you can go. It used to be pretty much cattle and truck farms and horse country and pickup trucks and small towns, etc., large places. The Bluemont Arts Festival was there, and I was when looking at the parking lot, there were far more Beamers than pickups. Now, obviously, a lot of the people that were there came from the eastern part of Loudoun County, like yours truly. But it was, to me, a symbol of what is happening there and what has happened in the past 10 years. That's your kickoff.
Okay. Yeah, Loudoun County, and I'm not sure how many folks in the room are from the DC region or if you're from elsewhere in the United States, but Loudoun County is the wealthiest county, according to the last census, in the nation. The DC area has 8 of the 10 richest counties in the country, and Loudoun is at the top of that heap. So what you're seeing is a place that used to be just this green expanse of rural Americana turning into some of these urban suburbs that Dante and Antoine are describing. It's really interesting to see how this plays out on the ground, because in cities like Leesburg, which is the capital of Loudoun, you have, it's a colonial town. It grew up in, I think, 1768. It was founded, and it first started to sprawl out into like McMansions and big box stores and malls and big shopping centers, office parks. And now what's happening is that whole landscape is changing because there's just a glide path of brains and money coming down 267 from the city and also from the Dulles technology corridor, and those people want to live in Loudoun. But their characteristics are a lot different than the people who were living there when this whole process got underway about 15 years ago. And that's that they are younger, they're more highly educated, they're more affluent, and they don't just come from DC or some other suburbs in the DC region. They come from all over the nation because they're drawn by the government function, government contracting, the think tanks, the research centers, the universities. So what they want is not a picket fence on a quarter or third of an acre lot anymore. What they really want is to live over retail. They want to walk to transit. They want to live the way they lived in the college center they came from or the city that they came from. So this has really changed, and as these guys are describing, it's changed the politics too. They tend to be more Democratic voters. Loudoun was an entirely Republican bastion 15 years ago. So you see dual pressures. You see the demographic pressure and the political changes that creates, and you see the influx of a totally demographically different type of individual and the pressure that places on the tax base, on development, on the retail mix, on the housing. And that is a really fascinating phenomenon that is absolutely not exclusive to Loudoun. It happens all over the region. And that is what's driving this sort of slow shift that's happening in the urban suburbs, the fastest growing communities in the country.
Bill, Michael? Yeah, push the mic over.
Well, here's a little perspective. Hi, Bill McInturf. Thank you for being here, and thanks for American University. I've worked with Jim Thurber and a lot of different folks at AU for years and just terrific programs. In 2004, George Bush carried 98 of the 100 fastest growing counties. And so after the 2004 election, the debate was about the substantial problem facing the Democratic Party, because in the fastest growing parts of the country, I mean, 90 out of 100 is sort of beyond margin of error. And of course, we've had the Great Recession since then. And those recessions have changed the counties, and that's something Dante and his partners have done a lot of work on. But it's a cautionary tale. And it's a cautionary tale, and over my long career, I keep being asked at different times to look at long-term kind of party change, meaning whether or not there's alignment. And I've been asked to do this different times in my career, and every time there's this predicted realignment, I keep saying the following. One, there are too many independents, and Americans hate both parties. And that those are conflicting views that kind of restrict long-term realignment. But this work is very important. And of course, the other thing about data, and this is what's so powerful about the data set being created, is you can test data and it's a testable hypothesis. One thing I'm very curious about is, for example, and this is why the exit polls are such a powerful database. It'd be very possible inside the exit poll to look at whites and just whites in these kind of urban counties. And my speculation would be the white vote did not shift that much. And that is what's happening in these urban counties is, to answer the two questions that were posed, is that we're watching what is the most important story in this country politically, which is the growth of the Latino population as a voting percent. And what you're seeing here in the chart is that the urban counties tip below 70% white. And when, in today's political terms, when you drop below 70% white, Republicans lose. And it speaks to Republicans, in my mind, either have to be competitive with the Latino vote, or they start getting, this kind of pressure will start happening in other kind of counties. And so my own thesis is this is less of a shift with the white vote and more a shift in the changing demographics, meaning the growth of the Latino population. And among the reasons that's important is the Latino population is sort of like where African Americans were kind of pre-Obama and 20 years ago, which is you have a lot of places where the Latino population is like 25% of all population. It's 21% of adults because they have so many kids. And of the 21% of adults, it's 18% of registered voters and then 16% of turnout. But those kids are going to rapidly age into voters. And when they do, they'll start voting at the same or higher rates. And then what we're going to see is the Latino percent's going to start mirroring instantly the percent they represent of registration, and in 10 or 12 years, the percent of the population. And when that happens, as a political party, Republicans can't lose 3-1 or there's no votes left. Because the Republican vote in this election, Republicans won the Republican vote by the highest margin since '88 and still lost by 4 points. So, you know, I think what you're watching here is a database that provides really power to look at and answer those kind of questions, and it's a very powerful tool. Last quick point is it's a tool that can be very hard to use in polling because these cell sizes are pretty low for a national survey, and it compels us to use a lot of merged data and big data to be able to actually apply this to real quick or analytical terms to a poll.
Okay, just want to make a couple points in reacting the presentation, a little bit of what Bill said. So first is what we see in the data, and there are two things we're looking at least that I see as the challenges going forward. I'm speaking as a Democrat, but also just looking at political demography. Is this just shifts in population, or is it sort of a battle or change in hearts and minds? And Antoine mentioned this a little bit. I'll get to it in a second. And the other thing is just from a practical political perspective. Some doing what I do and Bill does, trying to, at the base level, just say, trying to elect candidates. What does this data tell us, or how is it, what are we seeing as the challenge looking at it? So as, we've heard over and over, and I won't recite all the statistics, but obviously these different suburbs are growing in a way that's good for Democrats. Increase in minority percentage there, followed by, probably connected to, increase in poverty, and generally seeing more Democrats there. At the same time, the question is, as we look, as I said, the battle for hearts and minds, the idea of what the issue shift is, we wonder, is this just, and again, Antoine raised this question, is this just because Democrats are moving from the urban areas, moving from other areas, and making this more democratic, or is there really something happening there? And I would pose, and I hope is the case, that there is. The climate change difference is what has become a big split in society right now about, and I don't mean this to sound in a partisan way, but Democrats saying, oh, we've got to trust in science, Republicans having a different view on that, and that climate change is one good bellwether of that. You could mention evolution, a lot of other things, but I think climate change is something where we are still in the middle. Even was it in the suburbs, it is not a high priority issue, I would admit that, even though a lot of people are agreeing with the need to act, they don't put it at the top of their agenda. Gay marriage is something that's moved even quicker, and I will say this moved across the country, but here the suburbs were a leading indicator. So my hope, as I said, and the question here is, do Democrats have an edge in the suburbs, or is there actually a more fertile ground for us to go out and actually change minds that aren't necessarily, as Bill said, there are so many independents, hate both parties, even in the suburbs, but are they more open to our arguments? Now, the other basket I just want to raise here, speaking to someone who does try to elect candidates, just figuring out how we can use this data, in my case, to elect Democrats. And one of the things that's interesting about politics compared to this very detailed view is that despite all you hear about all the different types of communications, there are still two basic ways we communicate, and campaigns are all about communications. First, message, figuring out what to say, I won't get into that now, but the next is how do we get that message out? How do we communicate with people? And we want to find out. We always have limited resources. Even the Obama campaign at some point had limited resources, so they're trying to do it as efficiently as possible. So what is the first way we look at this? Media markets. Not only we're talking about bigger than the suburbs, but if you just look around, I don't know how well you know the DC media market, but we're talking about down to Prince William County, Alexandria, Arlington, Loudoun, then up north to not only PG County, but Montgomery, and many, many counties that are very different. And when we're spending our dollars, we are saying, okay, how can we go to that entire broad swath? Now, cable and other things give us some more opportunities to go a little more granularly, but still it is a different way of looking at things. It's almost the opposite of what we'd like to do, which is what this data does, give us the individual hit. Now, that's the other trend in communication, is micro-targeting or modeling, and there we're really doing something that cuts across all these counties. We're not saying we want to look at Montgomery County, or we want to look at Orange County in California, or whatever county it is. What we're saying is we are modeling a voter file or micro-targeting off our own poll data. And we are, if there's 5 people in a rural county who fit our model of who we need to persuade, we will have mail go to them. It's the good thing that mail still works, believe it or not, just have a lot more communications. And especially now where we can do email and internet, so people are getting web apps depending on where they live, we can make sure it's down at the zip code. And so there are other ways to communicate that sort of put us on a little bit in some way beyond this, and I say not beyond is better, meaning just that we're dealing in something different than just counties. And then the question is then, what is the value here? Well, we need political demography. And it ends up being, we do it as well on every campaign, even though I said there are some limitations, and it ends up being the art of putting people into boxes they don't want to be in. But, you know, and we know that the person in, I think what was called a tractor county, rural Republican in a conservative in a tractor county, say like Sioux County, Iowa, probably doesn't like being called, you know, a right-winger or a part of the tractor county vote. Jesus
some
land.
don't mind, I think.
Yeah, well, I know that. When I was saying this, okay, some people probably are proud of it, but they don't like being called part of the tractor vote, though, because it, you know, puts them into that group. And just like the people, say, in Montgomery County here, don't like being called the arugula latte Volvo vote, even though it may very well be true. So I think this is very, very useful because it helps us explain what's happening, and definitely is the best way that I have seen to examine what's happening.
Dante, Antoine, reactions?
Well, the first thing is that Bill said about the exit polls. I'm trying to get that data. I'd love to, because I was talking about trying to do this with somebody, but we need to get, it needs to be geotagged the right way, because I think that the problem is if it's broken out just by, if the only tag on it is urban, suburban, rural, I don't think it's terribly useful. To me, if the exit poll data, if we can get it broken down the way I want, even by zips or fips, we could see the question you're asking, because I wonder about that as well. And it's something, I actually think the white vote may have moved, since 2004 in particular, may have moved a bit.
Yeah, they don't, yeah, but here's what I don't get. I know that on the exit file, they have the number of the precinct that collected the exit poll.
Right.
So collecting and tagging that precinct within county would not be that hard.
Right.
So there is a geographic tag that would that may not be, you know, it would take a conversion, but it's not that hard. And there's a little bit of issue about 2012 in terms of getting the raw data yet. Apparently there's been some emotion and well, anyway, but that'll get cleared up. But when it does, I think this is a very solvable problem because they know exactly where the precinct was where the data was collected.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
You know, we focus just on Loudoun for a second because that is a place where this is really playing out, this change is playing out in sharp relief, but really the whole state of Virginia is a really cool example of this test right now with the governor's race there, the only competitive race in the nation this year. And it's sort of, you know, a battleground, it's a purple state, both parties want it, and they're trying to test out, you know, what's in play here? Why has Virginia gone from conservative to leaning Democrat? What is it? Is it the composition of the people? Is it the fact that the national party versus the local interests are deviant? I talked to Tom Davis, who was in the 11th district, which includes Fairfax County, and that's a county where this whole urbanization process is largely complete. He managed to win 7 terms. He even won by, I think it was 6% in 2006, which was a Democratic sweep year in Congress, just by focusing on local concerns. And what he was explaining to me was a rhino, a Republican in name only, is what you have to be a Republican and win in these urbanized areas. You have to focus on local concerns. Bill was mentioning the Hispanic immigrant population, which is very large in Fairfax County, so he focused on things that were of interest to his Salvadoran constituents, his Korean constituents. He backed the Korea Free Trade Agreement, which he would do as a Republican anyway. But he really focused on throwing his congressional weight behind local projects to the point where he was pretty roundly criticized for some of the things, the earmarks and the directed spending that he did while a congressman. But what he points out is that the National Party has lost its way in a state like Virginia because they're focusing on divisive social issues, abortion, same-sex marriage, educational vouchers, things like that, where people on the ground in counties like Fairfax are saying, that's not my interest. I have to drive an hour and a half to get to work every day. What are you going to do about the roads? What kind of funding are you going to free up for transit? Are we going to get that silver line out in Northern Virginia, or are you going to block it? And that's what's really interesting in the Cuccinelli, he's the Republican, and the McAuliffe race, in that just on the silver line, you can sort of see this interesting divide, because you have Cuccinelli opposing the second phase of the silver line, which would link Loudoun with the rest of us here in Washington by public trans, by subway, and you have McAuliffe backing it. Why? Well, maybe one reason would be because for McAuliffe, those are his peeps. They are the people who want to be on the silver line and want to use it to get in. And Cuccinelli, you know, this is something where the people who are out there and are voting reliably and consistently for the Republican Party are people who don't tend to want to live near public trans, and they don't tend to use it as much.
I want to make 2 more quick points, too.
Go ahead, Dante.
Something Michael said, and a lot of people have said this, obviously. Geography, the idea that getting beyond counties and going to zip code level, as a journalist, just with this project, there's 50,000 of them. It gets extremely difficult to do. Counties are nice, 3,100 of them. They're much better than districts to work with, and we can learn a lot through them, I think. The other point I'd make is micro-targeting, getting down to the individual level, reaching those 5 people in Nebraska. I would argue that in most cases, the vote is so, they don't really matter that much because nobody's going to that race is decided either for the presidency or even for a congressional district, that you can turn them out and you can do what you can to target them, but it's not, I don't think it's that big a deal. And to me, geography matters because it is true that if you are micro-targeting people, even through email, right, or by cable broadcasting, you're going to target people that are in line with your point of view. You're trying to turn them out. The thing is, what's happened is the way the country is split up, people tend more and more to live around people like them. So when you're targeting, it's like, I'm going to target these 100 people in Montgomery County. I need them, you know, or these 1,000 people. They're all going to live, I think, I don't know this for a fact, but I think you're going to find increasingly that they all kind of live near each other. My answer to this is always is that the most liberal person in America may live in the middle of rural Nebraska. I have no idea, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, what matters, because, you know, the one thing I've seen doing reporting on this project, community matters in that you live around people like you. When you live around people, when they're like you tend to talk and you tend to see the world more through their eyes. You tend to be more persuaded by their arguments. And you probably, one of the reasons is you chose to live there. If you have money and you can afford to move someplace, you chose to live there because you wanted the same kinds of things. And really quickly, one thing about what's driving the change, people moving in or hearts and minds being changed. I think it's impossible to measure that, but my guess is it's a bit of both. Some people leave, those persuadables that stay behind fall in line with the dominant culture.
I'm going to let Professor Yoshionaka have a comment after this one, but the people that matter the most to us, Republican or Democrat, blue or red, are the students right here. I'd like you to queue up and line up for questions, because I know some of you have classes coming up. So all of you that have questions, please start standing up right there, and we're going to go to questions right after Professor Yoshionaka has a chance to make some remarks.
Right. I just wanted to respond.
Antoine.
Yeah, thank you. Very quickly, I think I agree with Bill when he said that we have to be careful whether to characterize this as a realignment. And if you'll notice, I never mentioned realignment. I don't think Dante did either. And part of the reason is, realignment is kind of this interesting phenomenon where, first of all, in political science, social scientists are sort of thumbing their nose at this concept of realignment these days. No, it's true. And I mean, one of the things is, it's sort of like a recession. Like, we'll know what year from now if we were in a recession today. It's a bit like that with realignment. We'll know 30 years from now whether this was a realignment period or not. But I want to say one thing, though. If you look at the election results nationwide in the last, really decade and a half, the margins are very, very tiny, right? I mean, Bush v. Gore obviously was very close. Even by historical standards, Obama's quote-unquote landslide election of 2008 was actually not such a landslide. But again, if you compare to sort of historical standards. And so when we're dealing with small vote changes of 1 to 2 to 3 percentage points from one election to the next, small changes at the community level tend to be magnified. Right? A 1-point difference or a 2-point difference nationwide in big cities or in urban suburbs, et cetera, that's magnified, especially when we're dealing with a nation that's, Michael Barone a few years ago talked about a 49-49 nation or a 48-48 nation. We live in a nation that's close to being 50-50, so gaining 1 or 2 percentage points across the board can actually make a huge impact nationwide.
Let's start with a question over here. Please tell us who you are.
I'm Brian. I'm an undergraduate student here. I have a question that
Brian.
relates to voter turnout in these suburban, urban areas. Possibly could be an Obama effect, but I'm wondering, given a growing population, are we seeing an increase in voter turnout, or is it staying level? People are just changing the way they vote.
We haven't looked directly at turnout. I mean, I've looked at it a little bit, just comparing it. Just looking at the raw numbers and looking at it over time. I have not compared turnout. My guess is actually, the one thing about turnout is it varies so much election to election. I'd be really careful. I'd be really careful of any comments I make on it.
Bill?
Dante was involved with an earlier system that had a fewer county breaks, and we used that extensively working with Dante at NBC Wall Street Journal. And one of my interests was to look at whether or not those counties helped explain any shift in what happened in 2012 in terms of composition of the electorate. So we looked at those counties as a percent of the total vote, and it is startlingly consistent between 04 and 08 and 12. So that you see, like, you can say, okay, Obama increased turnout here, but guess what? In response in these counties, it turned out. And as we looked at that, we went out to 2 decimal points. You're talking about almost no change from 08 to 12 in terms of composition of the electorate. So although the overall vote dropped by a few million people, the composition by county type did not. And I think that's one of the major findings to me, that how stable 12 was compared to 8, compared to 4, in terms of the use of this kind of county-based targeting system.
Antoine.
I mean, looking at the data, that's absolutely correct, that the composition of the electorate hasn't changed that much, even though if you look at different subgroups, for example, youth turnout between 04 and 08 went up by a significant margin, but the youth vote in general is quite small relative to the entire country, and so that doesn't really change the makeup of the electorate all that much. Having said this, I think in recent years what you've seen is greater mobilization among racial minorities. And again, that might be, it's likely an Obama effect, but I think in the last election was the first election when African-American turnout was actually higher than white turnout, if I'm not mistaken. And so whether that persists into the future, we don't know. Obviously, I suspect that it might not, just given that Obama is not going to be on the ticket. But that's something that certainly we've seen in the last 2 elections.
Question on this side. Identifier.
My name is Katrin Aneker. I'm currently an assistant professor at George Mason University in the School of Public Policy. And I wanted to, first of all, congratulate you on your work. I have a comment. I think both of you wished for individual data. There is the National Suburban Poll conducted by the National Center for Suburban Studies at Hofstra University. Every other year, they've conducted this poll about 3 or 4 times now. I'm involved in this survey, and I would be happy to talk with you after this. Thanks.
Glad to have you.
We'll talk.
Jose.
Hi, my name is Jose. I'm a 4th-year undergrad student in the School of International Service. I have 2 questions. So the first one, in the data that was presented, I think it was inferring that with the increase of Latin or Hispanic people in suburban areas, that vote was going towards the Democratic Party alone. Is that really the case? Because I was under the influence that the Latino vote, because of religious beliefs, that they often voted for the Republican Party, or is it because of like Republican stance on immigration that, who are they voting for? Okay, that's question 1. And then also, if it is true that the Democratic Party really does get the minority vote, point blank, full stop, I think that's really unfortunate for the Republican Party. So for Mr. Bloomfield and Mr. McInturf, who you guys help people get elected, what suggestions or advice could you give to the Republican Party to help them rebrand themselves so they can start getting young black women to vote for them, for example?
Mike's not going to offer any help, I think.
Or help.
Well, it's unfortunate, but I don't think there is a Republican message to the African American community. There's an historic split that occurred over time. And if you look at African American attitudes on any number of issues about the role of government versus Republicans, there's not a match. I think at the margins there's stuff you can do, but I don't think, if in a political context or when you're running campaigns for a living, I think it's a very difficult vote. Michael and others could correct me. My recollection is the Latino vote that Romney was down to 27%, in this like 73-27. That is an unsustainable margin for a political party. So that if the Latino vote drifted the way of the African American vote, you cannot have whites have dropped 2 points since every election as a percent of the electorate since '88. And I was talking about how the Latino vote is going to age in very quickly in the electorate. And so some of that is, some of that can speak to immigration. But but there are other splits between Latinos based on country of origin, how long they've been in the country, by whether they speak Spanish or not Spanish, their level of acclimation. But as a party, there's this kind of fundamental sort of umbrella, which is, do you seem to be welcome in that party? You can have a policy debate in a way that makes people feel welcome, and you can have a policy debate that makes people feel excluded. And to the extent that people feel excluded, it doesn't matter where else you agree. They don't feel like they've been particularly welcome. We worked, I did not do the work, but there was Governor Perdue of Georgia. We tested a bunch of commercials after the 2006 cycle, which is the first round of immigration, to test Republican commercials on the topic of immigration. So we looked at some stuff that was run in Republican primaries and how that was tested, and we looked at Governor Perdue's stuff. And Governor Perdue did a commercial where he said, hey, you got to obey the law, but if you're here legally, this state wants to offer you an open hand and a welcoming hello, and here's what we could do for people who are here. And the difference between that commercial and that line versus the way it was presented by another different Republican candidate was massive in terms of how people reacted to that spot. And as a party, I'm just saying that has to be the challenge. And it also just means, as Republicans, by the way, having worked on this, you have to monitor more Latino candidates. You have to build up state legislative and a lot of other folks who are part of your party and culture. And you have to have candidates who learn to speak Spanish. And the last thing is, and this is the trouble, is we've had 2 cycles. The Democrats at a primary, but you're poor Mitt Romney, and you're desperately trying to win a Republican primary, and you wake up and say, oh, let's talk to Latinos. There's 5 months left. It's too late. You cannot start that effort with 5 months left in the campaign. It has to be an ongoing part of what you do, or it's not successful.
I think to the point of what Bill's talking about, I did a lot of reporting for Before the American Communities Project for Patchwork Nation. I actually had communities that I went to that represented each one of these types, and I spent time talking to people there. And there is a divide. It's not just that something you're seeing at the top of the Republican Party. When you go to places that are much more conservative, there is anxiety about immigration. I went to southern community in the southwestern part of Missouri, Nixa, which is a big evangelical enclave. In fact, the Assemblies of God is based around there, the church. And they brought up to me, I just said, let's talk about your community, and several people brought up immigration to me. I did not raise the issue to them. And it came up, and the issue was, why are those labels at the store? I don't like that those labels at the store are printed in Spanish as well. What's up with that? And so there's a problem that runs deep through the party. It's not something with the establishment. It's something they're going to have to deal with down further within the ranks of the party.
Another question over here, Jake.
Jake Whiteside. I'm a graduate student at George Washington University. My question was for Dante. I'm interested in this the Starbucks theory. So Thomas Friedman, Lexus and the Olive Tree, he presents the Golden Arches theory, and that's 2 nations that have simultaneously had McDonald's that never engaged in a war against one another. And that suggests something about a resolve economically. The consumer is more interested in a certain service rather than pursuing conflict. So does the Starbucks theory per 100,000 occupants or inhabitants, does that suggest something about political consumer preferences as well? I just wondered if you could expound upon that.
Yeah, this is an area that's of great interest to me, and I have access to all this Experian data now, which I'm just starting to figure out what the heck to do with. It's massive. It's a massive catalog of stuff. And to me, what's happened with the consumer preferences is what it's done is it's create communities that are more and more like terrariums because of niche marketing, right? You know, stores, I mean, look, the guy who opens a store on your corner opens a store on your corner because he's trying to make some money, whatever. But if Starbucks goes there, or Chick-fil-A, or Whole Foods, my God, Whole Foods, if you look at the data on Whole Foods, it's really clear what's going on, right? They trend like the index for Whole Foods in the index it's 186 for liberals, and I think it's like 80-something for conservatives. So, you know, what's happened is niche marketing has become very adept at saying, like, I need to maximize my profits. I know the people that shop at my store. They live there. I'm putting this store there. And then other stores that are like that cater to the same people cluster around it, and you end up creating an effect that I think that is something like a little terrarium. And man, look, I live in Upper Northwest. Upper Northwest is one of these places. Upper Northwest DC is full of a certain kind of person, and I'm one of them, who want a certain kind of thing, and we live where we live because that's what we want. And you know something? That's great as a consumer. It's terrific as a consumer because my life, my consumer life is so full. But I mean, there are all these places.
It's
there
getting
are all these
fuller.
places that are targeted to me that I live near, and that's wonderful. But what it also means, no, look, it's maybe a little different for me because my job is to try to look at the country outside of where I live. But for other people, what it means is it creates blinders. This consumer culture and the niche marketing is helping to create blinders that really makes it more and more difficult to see people that don't live like you. And just quickly, because this is something I'm doing a lot of work on, I think ultimately that becomes detrimental for the functioning of American democracy. And when we all have to come together on something, we increasingly live in different worlds, and consumer worlds really just kind of, the consumer world that exists around us is just making it more and more problematic.
Elizabeth.
I have a fun example from Whole Foods from my reporting. When I was at the Washington Post, I was covering the environment for a time, and I wrote about how rockfish in the Chesapeake Bay had developed a disease that was killing them. Now, all the experts said, we have no evidence to show that this affects the quality of the fish, how edible it is, whether it's toxic or whatever. The next day, the then governor of Maryland, Bob Ehrlich, a Republican, held a rockfish eating lunch in the governor's mansion to show, like, yum, I love this, and and the watermen were up in arms, and people were really upset. Whole Foods went exactly the other way. They took all the rockfish out of the store. They put up signs letting everyone know. And you could argue, is this a reaction to the quality of the food, or is it a reaction to the politics of the consumer who shops at Whole Foods? I just thought it was such a fascinating example because in the sort of Republican swath of Maryland, among the watermen and the fishermen and the people in the industry, they were furious, and they just demonstrated that they wanted to eat this fish. And on the other side, you had Whole Foods in Upper Northwest saying, we're on it, we're on it.
We have another question here. Go ahead, sir.
My name is Ray Zuniga. I'm a graduate student in SPA. And one of the interesting parts of this panel for me was talking about trying to predict voter share in terms of, I guess, both demographic variability, such as the increase in Latino population, but also you mentioned the Obama effect, which I would assume represents the change on the political side of who your representative is, right? But do you refer to the Obama effect in trying to predict what, I guess in terms of trying to predict what the Obama effect is, do you believe that's going to go down, and as in some aberration, or what I've seen in political news now is we see Hillary starting to put her name out on the Republican side. You see Rubio, other candidates who might have their own sort of Obama effect, maybe in some sort of way, if that makes sense. So basically, to sum up, how do you think the Obama effect on the political side, the potential variability in that, in terms of the Democrats or Republicans, how important is it?
Anybody want to start that one? Michael.
It is very hard to transfer personal popularity to any other candidate. That's just a rule not about President Obama, that's for anybody of either party. What his legacy vote is worth is even harder to figure out because you're going to talk about what's going to happen over the next year or so. I mean, he was an extraordinarily strong candidate in 2008 and then I think ran a strong race, did well in 2012. A lot of that, though, as we've been hearing, has been Democratic Party has been stronger in those two presidential elections. And then going back to Bill's point, hard to say you were going to have a realignment when in the off year between those, it is, let's say, just goes the exact opposite direction. So there's always the case when you're looking at all the data that there is, to some extent, while you're trying to find outliers, but where trends are exaggerated. But in general, and I looked at 8 or 9 random suburban counties, and the vote went, Bill Clinton, it was here, Bush, it was here, I'm talking about for Democrats, and kept it here, and then when Obama wins, he puts it up here again. So there is a little bit of effect of following the national popularity and it's the national fortunes of the overall party, and it's hard to predict that right now.
Question on this side? Ma'am?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, got to excuse us.
I think it's an important story because, again, part of what I look at when you look at the composition of the electors, you look at the percent the electorate represents, and then they represent the vote. And so we've had 2 cycles in a row where African Americans were above census in terms of their level of census in terms of turnout. That may be and probably is a consequence of the president and might hard be due for a white Democrat. But it's a point. Right. You know, we're talking about points matter, but it's a point. The point I would say to my party, which can be somewhat resistant to hear it, is look, there are longer-term trends. 18 to 29-year-olds are a bigger part of the electorate. Latinos are a bigger part of the electorate. And you are totally kidding yourself if you think this is a function of Barack Obama. This is a function of underlying dynamics and demographics in the country, and this is going to continue. And the second thing is, and this is also hard for people to kind of get, is most of the political science was based on a certain kind of presidential race based on a certain amount of money. And all of this mechanical stuff was based on this sort of big, quote, a big presidential race. Well, the last presidential race was $2 to $4 billion. And so how do we measure that? NBC Wall Street Journal, we asked you, and if you lived in a swing state, we asked you in 2004, mid-October, have you been contacted by a presidential race? It was 32%. 2004, it was like considered, oh my God, it was exceptional. That was the hugest race ever. 2008, it was like 50. This year, in mid-October, 73%. Yeah. So if you were living in a swing state, 3 out of 4 people said, yeah, I've been contacted by a presidential race personally. Why? Because the money went from $500 to $600 million to $2 billion. So my other point is what we think about in terms of composition of the electorate is going to be radically changed when we're running $2 billion Citizen United elections. And so underlying demographic changes are what drives composition now, not interest in the electorate, the candidate, all that. It's with $2 billion, if this is how big the people are and you get them to vote, that's how big the vote is. And it will not stop because Obama's not the nominee.
Okay, Dante, and then we'll go to a question.
And I also think just to point quickly on money and turnout, you know, if you look at the turnout, you look at the turnout in states and that are not battlegrounds, turnout is low. Texas is a big state. Their turnout is very low, and that's because they don't really consider, they don't think their votes matter, and people don't spend money there. So I actually think even the turnout numbers that you see and the demographic shifts you see, these numbers will change. If a state starts to become in play because of a demographic shift, there could be a very quick change in what the vote looks like because of turnout changes, because of ad spending. That's one thing. The other thing, really quickly, just talk about realignments. I don't believe in realignments either. I'm glad that Antoine said that it was voodoo in among political scientists. I don't believe in it either. I don't think these numbers show that the suburbs are gone for Republicans. I don't think that's what these numbers show at all. But what they think they do show is it requires a change in tack to reach some of these places if you're the Republican Party.
Okay, ma'am, just identify yourself and I'll get back to you, Antoine. Okay, we'll get back, Antoine. Ma'am, go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Lucia and I'm an undergraduate student in the School of Public Affairs. I just wanted to ask about how the focus on social conservatism in the Republican Party, it's definitely alienating voters. And I'm wondering if you think that the Republican Party is then shifting more libertarian, where is it shifting? And if it does shift in the future, where will those ultra-conservative, socially conservative voters go?
Those are great questions. They're not the topic of the panel. So I'm going to skip answering it because I don't think it's what the panel is dealing with here in terms of the topic.
Antoine, you had something to say for the previous question, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, just real quick, regarding turnout. I mean, that's one area. I mean, if you were to stack every political science study on turnout, you probably could go to the moon and back a couple of times. We know quite a bit about turnout. Some of the recent studies on turnout show that it's an habitual behavior. So it's hard to get people to vote sometimes, but once you get them to vote, especially at an early age, by meaning sort of in their 20s, that behavior then tends to perpetuate itself. And so if it's true that Obama was able to mobilize, and I mean, we know it's true, we've seen the data, was able to mobilize sort of college age and young adults at a higher rate than previous candidates, and if it's correct that turnout is habitual, then one would expect future elections to still reflect some of that and some of that mobilization among populations that traditionally have not voted at such a high rate.
I just a remark on, again, going back to Virginia, which is really my Jones lately. The ad spending there is just unbelievable because it's seen as a sort of national test of you know, who is going to carry the message in 2016, who has an edge. But the ad spending there is really remarkable for this gubernatorial race because you have McAuliffe, he's brought in $19 million, and Cuccinelli 12.7. And of those numbers, only about 1/4 of that for McAuliffe and about 1/3 of that for Cuccinelli is actually from Virginians. It's all national money, it's all super PAC money, and it's people who see Virginia as a microcosm of the United States, and they're trying to see which way they can pull a race that will be decided by turnout.
I don't like to leave a question hanging that the panel can't answer, and you're right. We didn't talk about the makeups of the party or tactics here, but to the lady who asked a question about where the social conservatives go, here's one way of looking at it, just as a citizen thinking about it, and it comes from that great politician, Pope Francis, who all of a sudden decided, and it's not so all of a sudden if you look at his background, decided it just might be healthy for the church to begin thinking about things like social justice and poverty, the things that bring the flock together, as opposed to some of the other things that seems to be moving the flock apart. And it seems to me social conservatives have a lot to share with other people in the electorate when they move away from some of the hot button issues. And for the Republicans, there may in fact be a lesson in that. That's just an opinion. Any other questions we have? Paul, you got one? Or?
Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir, here.
My name is John. I'm an ex-suburban voter.
Recovering.
Go ahead, John.
But in terms of geography, what about factors such as, aside from messaging, factors such as gerrymandering districts, and as Dante said about likes living together, does that make it easier to, in essence, restructure voting so that you could have what happened in 2012 where more voters, I think, voted Democratic for the House, but the House is overwhelmingly Republican? Can that be a forward-going function? And on the other side, does that also make it easier in terms of voter suppression tactics, where you can use structural factors to affect the election? And I think the focus on messaging is interesting, but sometimes you get the Republicans associated knowing how to play the structure, and the Democrats, in essence, playing football on a baseball field and leaving that open, so you end up with more voters voting for one party, yet the other party getting elected.
Well, I would say some of this is not strategy. It's or maybe a lack of strategy, but it's just the idea that Democrats, unfortunately, have lost in the elections that lead up to redistricting. We've had bad years, just like we had bad 2010. We had the same thing happen the decade before, and that gives us the districts which we don't like, and the Republicans put together. And yes, what they do is they, you know, one of the key things, and to the, you who asked about the idea of reaching out to the minority vote, one of the things that happens, which Bill can talk about it more, but I think why Republicans aren't always reaching out naturally is because they have packed all the black voters and minority voters in general into a district to say, okay, the Democrats can have that one district, and tried to win off all the others. And so, you know, yes, there's probably a change in messaging, and also, I mean, for them, for us, it just puts us in much more on the outside the urban areas and the suburban and exurban areas. And when you look at some of these, they're not like Montgomery County. Gwinnett County in Atlanta, in Georgia, or Cobb County in Georgia is not like looking at Montgomery or Arlington, Alexandria. These are very, very different areas, though I'd say they're both suburban. And it just gets harder and harder for us to win once we're pushed in those. But it does push us to have a message that is a little bit further reaching.
Quickly, just on the difference between Republican and House, just the makeups of the constituencies, because we looked at this actually in the journal. In the 113th Congress, and this is looking at Hispanic vote, because that's what we were talking about in terms of immigration. The Hispanic population of Republican districts is about 12.5%. That's the constituencies in Republican districts, about 12.5%. In Democratic districts, it's 22.5%. And if you just use those numbers, there's a lot of things that make a place what it is. But that Hispanic population, those Republican districts, mirrors the United States in about circa 1994. And that that Democratic Hispanic district, that's what America is supposed to look like, the Hispanic Census District, in about 2025. So they really are, they're representing very different constituencies right now. It's because of the way the districts were drawn. I think both sides play the game about trying to get as much as they can, but yeah, the Republicans have been in the position to draw the districts they want, and they've done a good job with it.
That's, of course, an exciting contrast to 1950, 60, 70, and 80. So I wrote an article after this last election using that line from the baseball movie, There's No Crying in Redistricting. We had a generation, 2 generations of districts where Republicans would get 48, 49% of the vote and 44% of the seats. Like in 1980, during the Reagan sweep, Republicans essentially had 49% of the vote, 44% of the districts. So there was about a 5-point gap between the vote cast and the districts. That's what happened to Democrats this time. Because the 2010 redistricting, we had so many Republican governors and legislatures. But in some ways, this crosses party, meaning that we have all those decades where we had Democrats do the same thing. But this is where incumbent members of Congress share an interest, which is to give me the most partisan district possible. And as somebody who's worked in redistricting for a large part of my career, the trouble is that if you go to the average member of Congress, so you can have a safer partisan seat for you or you can be a good soldier for the party, they say, well, thanks for my better partisan seat. And so we've compacted both types of districts. And what it also means, and this is the public policy consequence, is when people ask me how do we stop the partisanship in Congress, we have no competitive House seats to speak of by any historic standard. And so right now we have 26 seats where a person got elected that's different how they voted for president. When I started during the Reagan era, we literally had like 130 seats like that. We've gone from 130 seats to 26 seats where you cross party. So what it means is, and this happens on both sides, is the average member of Congress is acting rationally, which is how do I not lose a primary? If you had court-drawn seats, and Antoine is an expert in redistricting, and we can draw seats now incredibly precisely, and court-drawn seats were done by neutral political criteria, and we woke up with 150 to 200 competitive seats, any Congress would be radically different because the member of Congress would be looking for how to survive a general election. And so it's not, this is something both parties share in terms of wanting to keep what they had, but it has had extraordinary public policy consequence, and we're getting the public policy consequence of rational acting, which is don't lose a primary on both sides, because those majority-minority seats elect very, very liberal Democrats who, and by the way, here's my other point, is when people say, gee, you know, your party doesn't represent this, I said, well, you know, you should go look at the districts they represent. They're very, very effective spokespeople for what their district believes. So are the Democrat members. But the Democrat members are in, lots of them are majority-minority seats, and they're being very passionate advocates for what their constituents want. My former wife was the grandmother of Romanian democracy. She helped write the Constitution. And and Republicans and Democrats, we train all these people. And so the Romanians were very excited. They had their first election. They had their first year as a parliamentary system. The American delegation flew back after the year, and they said, hey, how's it going? And the Romanians said, it's great, and we really are very excited. We only have one question for you American experts. And they said, what's that? I said, well, are we supposed to vote for what we think is right or what the people elected us want? And the American delegation broke out laughing and said, okay, well, that'll be the next chapter of the Federalist paper written in Romania. Good luck. But that's the point I'm saying is if it looks to you like we have paralysis, it's because we have very effective members of Congress who are, in fact, representing their districts. We've just drawn them to be very partisan.
Antoine.
If I may, I mean, the statistic that shows that, you know, Democrats got more votes, more House votes than they got House seats in terms of percentage. I mean, it's often mentioned as sort of a sign that the system is unfair. I have this kind of a pet peeve of mine, but that number is more or less meaningless because we don't have a national election at the House level in the United States. We have 435 individual elections. So the aggregation of votes at the local level, to say that Democrats got fewer votes or got more votes and fewer seats, part of that is simply a function of the fact that if you were to array seats from most competitive to least competitive, most of the lopsided seats are Democratic seats. I mean, the seats that are won with literally 80 to 90% to almost, to sometimes 100% of the votes, they tend to be Democratic seats because then those tend to be urban seats, seats where Republicans don't field a candidate. And so you get this lopsided distribution where Democrats can rack up millions and millions of votes in those districts that have no competition. And then the few districts that are competitive, some of them are red, some of them are blue. And so once you aggregate those, then Democrats get more votes. But that's simply a function of the fact that a lot of the non-competitive seats happen to be Democratic seats. And so I would not use the national vote as an indication of sort of the national mood of the country, if only because what you really have are 435 local elections.
We are almost out of time, and before we have closing statement here, is there anybody who wants to say something that has not had a chance to? Is there a final question from anyone? We started out asking questions about the electorate and how it's changing, and we've gotten into at least one answer to the question why the government may shut down. Because we have partisan drawn districts in which members are voting the way their districts want them to vote. And if they don't agree, it's because that's what their constituents want. It seems to me that's a very interesting question to probe at another time, perhaps on redistricting and partisanship. Yeah. But nevertheless, I would like to thank Bill McInturf, Elizabeth Williamson, Michael Bloomfield, and our own Anton Yanishaka and Dante Cini for this presentation about suburbia. Thank you all, and everybody can go to class.